Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Fall NMLS Ombudsman meeting. I'm Stephanie Bonomo from CSBS. Now, without further ado, I'd like to invite the Director of Examinations and Assistant Deputy Commissioner for the Kansas Office for the State Bank Commissioner and your NMLS Ombudsman, Jim Payne. Jim, will you join me on stage?
Perfect. Thank you for that introduction. Well, welcome everyone. As Stephanie said, this is our virtual Ombudsman meeting for fall of 2021. It's incredible to think that a year ago we hosted our first virtual, and here we are hosting the third. Although we can't be together in person, I do hope you find the next couple hours engaging. As always, I'm looking forward to it. This is always a great experience, and I do look forward to our first in-person meeting as your Ombudsman sometime soon. I hope you've all been continue to stay safe and positive through these unprecedented times. And I know it's been a challenge for everyone involved. Our industry is not alone, but we do have unique challenges that I hope we can work through together. So just to give a little overview of the office, the Ombudsman is a resource for NMLS and SES users with the goal of assisting in the resolution of policy and operational issues. The objective of the Ombudsman office in this meeting is to foster constructive dialogue between industry users of these systems and state regulators to mutually work towards the goal of modern and efficient financial services regulation. Now, while some issues brought to the NMLS Ombudsman can be resolved rather quickly, others take months or even years for resolution. In addition to topics raised during the spring meeting held in April, the Ombudsman inbox received 105 emails between March 1st and August 30th of this year. The emails are typically reviewed by me, and either I'll respond directly or engage the SRR staff. Many of the questions answered are answered with help from the NMLS call center, various departments within CSBS, state regulators, and the CFPB. Over the last 7 months, the Ombudsman inbox received an average of 18 emails per month. The top 5 categories of the inbox were entitlement issues, testing questions related to the SAFE MLO test, how to file consumer complaints, the licensing application process, and education related with the BioSig ID program. Those are the top 5. So moving on, between March 13 and May 31st of this year, on behalf of the NMLS Policy Committee, the Conference of State Bank Supervisors, or CSBS, invited public comments and feedback in support of the modernized system for NMLS regarding the networked licensing model, the licensing requirements framework, the core requirements proposal, and the proposed identity verification process. CSBS received 10 responses from a variety of organizations in the debt, mortgage, money services business, and consumer finance industries. Based on the responses received, the industry has shown that it's very supportive of the NMLS modernization goals of increased efficiencies and streamlined processes. However, they do recognize the system will not be successful if states are not committed. Their primary concerns focus on state adoption of the modernized system's requirements and processes, to the implementation of the new system for existing licensees, and finally, the limited specific details that were currently available in the model. And they look toward plans for the future. In their comments, industry did not note opposition to the majority of the requirements identified as core in the proposal. If you recall, core requirements are defined as those demographic and other basic information that, regardless of industry, all non-bank entities are required to provide. Core requirements are not configurable by state agency, and they're universal to all non-bank financial services companies. CSBS is still working on an official response to these comments and the resulting recommendations and changes to the proposal. And a response will be posted soon in the NMLS Resource Center. The other system within our NMLS ecosystem is the SES, or the State Examination System, and it's approaching its 2nd birthday. The system already boasts users from 49 state agencies for the exam and investigation work, And 14 state agencies are using SES to record and address consumer complaints received. With nearly 1,500 exams and 1,200 complaints handled, the SES quickly has become a critical change driver towards network supervision goals. While system adoption has been brisk, there is more work to do. We need to improve the consistency of examinations from agency to agency. And this can be done through a combination of policy work to reach agreement on the questions that regulators are asking of companies and what procedures they're conducting, as well as system enhancements that encourage more uniformity. So before we begin with the topics on today's agenda, I've asked Bill Young, Vice President of NMLS Business Services with CSBS, to provide an update on the NMLS Modernization project and the work that CSBS has done in the last year to further that network supervision. So Bill, if you'd please turn on your camera and mic. Hello.
Thanks,
Welcome.
Jim, and hi everyone. I just wanted to provide an update on our NMLS modernization effort. Jim mentioned the licensing requirements framework. Since the framework is central to our work, I thought I'd provide some background for those who haven't heard and an update on the work that we've done. Jim already covered the basics, but what we have done from, Jim mentioned that we've gone out for regulator and public comment periods for the licensing model and the framework and core requirements. We are also, we've also concluded our regulator and public comment periods for the money transmission business specific requirements, and are close to finalizing those. Really the next big step for us, given that the mortgage industry makes up 75% of the licensees on NMLS, we'll be tackling those business-specific requirements next. We've begun analyzing the existing state requirements, and we'll begin to share our findings with the NMLS Modernization Steering Committee shortly. Stay tuned for more information at the ARMOR conference, which is 2 months from today. Development of the system is underway, and we've been working with both regulator and industry working groups for input and feedback. We're frequently asked when the new system will be available. Since we're still early in the development cycle, we are not ready to publish an estimated timeline. We previously had mentioned the Money Transmission Modernization Act, which has been the guidance for building the system. It is also the background for the national standard that we've created for the business-specific requirements. We've been working with the state agencies to help identify any changes they may need to be able to adopt this national standard for the money transmission licensees. And many of the states will need to make changes to their laws and regulations to adopt. Despite this, the vast majority of agencies have provided a verbal commitment to adopt NMLS Mod and the implementation of this national standard. We're really excited about that, and with our drive to uniformity. Thanks so much for your time, and thanks to those of you who have provided feedback on the business-specific requirements and the licensing model. And thanks to those of you that have worked with us on this effort. Back to you, Jim.
Thank you, Bill. All right, next up, we will hear from an update on SES from Kyle Thomas, Vice President of SES Business Services with CSBS. Welcome, Kyle.
Thank you very much, Jim. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to give you this update about the state examination system. And as you heard Jim mention, we really recently celebrated the second anniversary of the go live of SES pilot exams. It seems hard to believe that that was just 2 years ago, but when one of those years is a pandemic year and continues to be another pandemic year, time seems to kind of ebb and flow and go pretty quickly. Shortly after those pilot exams, though, we went live in March of 2019. So SES is coming along. Since our go live, the system has seen 9 releases, each bringing new features and enhancements to you, our users, on the regulator and company side. And since then, SES has been getting good marks from both companies and regulators alike. But as you will hear, and as I'll describe, there are certainly areas in both the policy that Jim alluded to and the functionality that we must address in order to achieve our vision, which is efficient, networked supervision. So you'll hear a little more about that in the remaining agenda, but I'd like to leave you with some statistics that I think really underscore the criticality that SES, the critical role that SES has assumed in just these 2 years. You certainly heard Jim mention the 1,500 exams or investigations and the 1,200 complaints that have gone through or are currently working their way through the system. That's a higher level of activity than we anticipated this early on in SES's life cycle. But this level of activity translates to some pretty impressive numbers. First, well over 100,000 documents, responses to information requests, loan files, and other regulator company exchanges have happened through the system in these first 2 years. All of that done securely and efficiently. That's, I think, especially impressive or especially useful in this remote environment that we all found ourselves in suddenly overnight. And if you consider what was before this, the days of exchanging things on paper, mailing CDs, emailing documents, and often too large for email exchanges, and certainly not nearly as secure, we now have a much more contained, reliable process of exchanging that critical information between regulators and companies. Next, there are over 3,000 company users active in the system. That doesn't mean at any one point, but 3,000 of you, our company users, have logged in or are a user of the system at some point. And nearly 700 regulators from the 49 agencies that are currently using the system for either exams, complaints, or both. And the companies being examined through SES represent the biggest nationwide operators to small, local mom and pop shops. So SES is not one size fits all. It is customizable. It works for the biggest companies and it works for the smallest companies. Impressively too, states are increasingly leveraging the work of other states by sharing reports of exams and collaborating together through the exam process through SES in a way that was not possible before the system went live. If you think about the complexity there, in order for one state to request the exam of another state, they either had to know that that state examined that company, which they wouldn't have, or they asked you, a company user, to provide it in their next exam, which then required you to provide that information. Well, with SES, states can see in a limited way the work of other states and request more information from their peers when it's appropriate. And you may not sound like a win for companies when I describe that, but certainly our goal with that is that those exchanges of information translate to fewer or at least briefer exams. And finally, to the network supervision goals of our organization and the system as a whole, more and more multi-state exams are happening in SES every week. The majority of these are in the mortgage space, but increasingly on the money transmission side, we're seeing states partner together to examine companies. Not just the largest companies, but often regional operators. We're learning a lot through those processes. We're going to learn how the multi-state examination process is going to change with our new technology, and we'll continue to adapt the technology to fit the best practices that we're learning about. So while much work is yet to be done to achieve our ambitious network supervision goals and drive towards a more uniform, consistent regulatory process, SES certainly has paved a solid path for getting there together. So no matter whatever industry you're in, whatever agency you're from, we look forward, the team here anyway, looks forward to working with you to bring whatever supervision or complaints work you have onto our system. I look forward to the rest of the agenda. Turn it back to you, Jim.
Thank you, Kyle. And congratulations to the entire SES team on the 2nd anniversary of the system. So that's quite a remarkable milestone, and thank you for that update. If anybody has any questions on the NMLS modernization or on the SES update, feel free to drop them in the chat on the comments section there, and we will pick those up as we go. So before we begin, I do want to express my happiness that a frequent, one might say legendary, Ombudsman meeting participant is back to work after a serious health scare this past fall. Gus Avocados with Miles and Stockbridge is back to work and doing well. So Gus, your NMLS friends are very happy that you're doing well, and we wish you all the best for the future. So let's jump into the agenda without further ado. Today's meeting is made up of 3 panels. During each panel, we'll have our topic presenter talk about their submission, and then we'll have further discussion with the rest of the panel, which is made up of both regulators and industry members. We will also discuss questions and comments that are posed through the chat. We'll reserve those for the end of each panel. And unfortunately, due to the nature of the virtual meeting, we won't have an open forum section where other issues may be raised. So please continue to send those issues to ombudsman@nmls.org. So first up, we have Cindy Corsaro with Promontory Mortgage Path LLC, and her submissions related to her experience with SES. Joining her is Daryl Wetter with the Kansas Office of the State Bank Commissioner, who serves as chair of the SES Steering Committee. We have Anya Tabb with Washington Department of Financial Institutions, and she serves as chair of the Multi-State Mortgage Committee, or the MMC. And as well, we'll have Kyle Thomas with CSBS. So if everybody could unmute and turn on your cameras and join me on stage, please.
So first of all, I want to thank Jim, our fantastic ombudsman, and the CSBS and the NMLS for this opportunity to represent industry on this very cool SES system that we're all working with. So I am a new member of the SES. I've had 2 examinations, and you might say, well, why are you speaking to issues in the SES if you've only had 2 exams? The reason is that one exam was absolute perfection, easy, upload the answers, put in the documents, hit submit, and you're done. The other exam at the exact same time presented a lot of issues. So to protect the innocent, I will not mention any states during this presentation, but I just wanted to point out what I saw that I thought would be beneficial for all states to hear, just in case they're doing the same thing. So our goal is to be an organized, structured, streamlined, uniform system. What I saw with this one exam was they essentially took their paper exam questions and basically cut and pasted them into the standard questions, or they made their own questions, I'm not quite sure, that created a real difficulty in being able to use the SES in an easy fashion. So to give an example, one question was uploaded, but in that question were 15 sub-questions. And the SES is not made to answer sub-questions. It's made to put one question answer into the comments box. So what we ended up having to do was create outside of the SES a separate document with 1 through Z, A through Z, and answer all the questions, and then cut and paste and upload it into the SES. That's really slowed down the process so that it wasn't an easy system. It was a customized system just for that particular state. So that was the first question and first issue that I saw. The second was, and I am representing other counterparts in industry. This isn't just my experience, because I did gather some information before this meeting. We're seeing that sometimes the regulators are just looking at the lender license, for instance, and they're choosing all the lender questions without really looking closely at the MCR and what the activities are that the entity is participating in. So you get a lot of NA questions, not applicable. And where those are easy to answer, it is time consuming both for the regulator to review as well as the licensee to have to review and upload. So a request to the regulators, in addition to not just cutting and pasting your old exam into the SES, would be to really take a hard look, maybe even a pre-exam, reach out email, and see exactly what they have been doing, the entity, during the time frame of the exam, so that the questions can be more targeted to each licensee. The other problem, is that I saw with this particular exam that there were 2 places I had to upload documents. One was in the SES, and another was a specified file share site outside of the SES. So now we had to pay very close attention to the questions and how they were answered, where the uploaded documents needed to go. And it just, as a user, it didn't make sense to me why we couldn't upload all of our documents in one place in the SES. So that was another utilization of the system that seemed a little bit not the way it should be. Another issue, and interestingly enough, this just recently came up for me, is one of the states, I have a recent exam, they are marked on the map as using the SES for both examinations and complaints, and yet they are asking me to use an outside examination portal that their state sponsors. Every time we're asked to use something separate from the SES, we have to adapt to that particular portal, the requirements, how to use it, upload documents. Sometimes the portal doesn't work. I had that issue where I uploaded 37 documents. They did not save properly, and I had to do it all over again. My experience with the SES, with that first exam, was so easy. You put all the comments in, you upload the documents, you hit submit. In this particular outside exam portal, if you had an NA question answer, you had to write it into a Word document, save it, and upload it because there was no comment box within that examination portal. So again, if our goal is to be able to have a uniform, standardized system for network supervision, it would be really helpful if the states could really take a hard look at how they're using the system and maybe adjust accordingly. Now, I did discuss this with Kyle, and I know he's going to comment on what y'all are trying to do to fix these issues. So I have some solutions, because I firmly believe if you're going to talk about something that's a problem, at least offer a possible solution. So my first question to Kyle was, do you provide training to the states that are using the examination system? Because if there is training, perhaps it needs to be a little more detailed, a little more expanded. I don't know if there are help guides or if there's a helpline for the regulators and the examiners, but that might be really helpful so that you can see a more uniform approach to the way the questions are being put into the SES. The other suggestion would be to review a sample of all the states that are using the examination system, just to make sure they're using it properly and not customizing so much so that you end up with an exam that should be 50 questions and now it's 150 questions because you have all these subtext answers that you have to provide. One other enhancement, this is not a problem, but this is an enhancement that industry would love to see, is that you are unable, once you answer all your questions and upload all your documents and hit submit, you are unable to print that report. And if we could look into that functionality, it would be greatly appreciated, because when you have your exit interview and they refer to a particular question, unless you have cut and pasted or printed out every page as you go for each question, there's no easy way to refer to it once the exam is submitted. So again, thank you, Kyle and SES and the CSBS for creating this system. I know those of us who have used it and had a good experience are incredibly happy, because it is a burden when you are in 51 jurisdictions and the exams are coming pretty fast and furious. To have this ability to have a streamlined streamlined tool to use for answering your questions in a timely manner. So I think if state examiners, regulators, industry, CSBS, NMLS, SES, if we all collaborate and work together, we can reach the robust, dynamic SES system that was envisioned when we first rolled this out. So thank you for my time, and happy to hear from regulators and Kyle as to what I have presented.
Well, thank you very much, Cindy. And thank you for being such a good advocate for the company side. I know it's not easy getting up here and speaking before your regulators and your peers, and you do it very well. So thank you.
Thank you.
I think I'll kind of play the role here too of traffic director. So I'll maybe address the first question you asked about our training process and the process we have of bringing new states onto the system, because I think I can speak to that quite well. I'll maybe ask Anya to speak to some work streams that just recently started around reviewing the information requests and what we're hoping to achieve there. And then Daryl, as the chair of our steering committee, I'm hoping maybe you can kind of share some insight as to how we balance, flexibility in the system with what we're trying to achieve as far as standardization from a functionality standpoint, and just the kind of trade-offs there. So maybe I'll start and just say on the training front. So first, we do provide training to the state agencies, but it's largely functionality based. So we work with each agency and teach their examiners how to use the system, but we have taken a lighter touch on teaching them how to examine through the system, if you will. So it's more learning to use the new system, relying on them to kind of know what their exam process is and how their exam process works. That's actually the second step. Before even that training happens, we go through what we call our onboarding process, and we bring each agency through kind of an orientation process, and we get them up to snuff with the information we need and what information they're going to be putting in. And I think this is where we have a big opportunity to improve our internal processes based on what we're learning. Essentially, we show the states how to use the system, how they can put their information requests and procedures into the system, and we turn them loose. Our hope is that each agency look at the standards that are in the system and don't duplicate a state request with the standard that's already in there. So for example, if a standard is in on the mortgage side asking for your Bank Secrecy Act policy, well, we're hoping that that standard suffices for the states who also need to see your Bank Secrecy Act policy. But what we're seeing, and there's some good reasons for this at the state level, from a functionality standpoint, I think we've got some opportunities to do some improved development here. What we're seeing is that some state agencies take their old request list that they're familiar with and that they're comfortable with and that they know their companies are comfortable with, and they're adding those questions in, assuming that kind of the status quo for their companies is maybe an easier and more familiar space. Where that becomes a challenge, though, is that then when they draw up an information request for their next exam, there'll be a lot of duplicates. The standards come on, the state-specific questions come on, and in some cases, like you're mentioning, if an agency has added questions that have 15 or so sub-bullets, those don't work very well in SES. And so I think we've got opportunities in our onboarding and training processes, certainly, to show what comes out of the other end of that for the regulator or for the company, after they've been putting all that content and all that information request information into the system. I think just showing them what the company users go through and how your life is responding to those things will actually go a long way to kind of improving that process. So that's kind of the way it's working now. I certainly see some opportunities, but I'm maybe even more excited to hear from Anya and Daryl about some of the policy work that we're doing through the working group, and the system functionality opportunities that exist in the system. So I don't know who wants to go first, but I'll maybe turn it over to you, Anya.
Sure, yeah, I can go next. So I can speak to kind of the questions that are in the system currently and what we're looking at doing. So the MMC, which is the Multi-State Mortgage Committee, for those who don't know, recently kicked off a working group to review the information requests that you're seeing and how they populate in the system on our side. So when the system was initially set up, all the MMC questions that you would get on a multi-state examination were put into the system to populate on every exam. And as we've gotten into, doing exams on a single state basis, we've realized that, that's maybe not the most efficient way. There's some questions in there that typically wouldn't be asked on a single state exam, and that we really need to dial in kind of what our core questions are that we want to be asking on single state exams that align across the majority of state agencies. So I, with Kyle and some other CSBS staff, have recently kicked off a working group to basically go through and review all the questions and identify what really is that core question that's commonality across the majority of states that, maybe Washington is asking one way and Kansas is asking a slightly different way. Currently, you're outside of the system, but really the meat of the question is the same. So the goal of that group is really kind of to pare it down, make it clean so that you get those information requests that apply across the board. And, I don't think we'll ever have 100%, obviously, of questions for Kansas and Washington aligning, but you could get maybe 80% or the bulk of the questions. And then really the only additional questions that would be added in are things that are state specific or those states really need to see based on your business type. And kind of along those lines, Cindy, you had mentioned, the questions should really align with the business activities that you're doing in the state. And on the, I don't know, Kyle, if you want to chime in on this, or maybe Daryl, you're going to speak to this, but the way the system works is that the information requests populate based on your business activity as in NMLS. And so that's another thing that the group is looking at for all those information requests that are in the system is where do those really fit? Are we asking these questions of the right people for the, right type of, for the type of exam that's being conducted? So, does this really apply to servicing, or should it just be a question that doesn't normally populate and a state could add it if they wanted to? So that's kind of what we're doing in my group to streamline the process and really maybe try to get rid of some of those pain points on the industry side and maybe even on the agency side, because there are so many questions since it was based on the multi-state examination process.
Yes, and
Go ahead, Daryl.
Sure, and yeah, I'll add on to what Anya said here about the standards in the system and just give you kind of Kansas's take on it. Our examiners are looking forward to the core group, identifying some better targeted standards, I guess would be a better way of saying it. So we don't have the kind of shotgun approach of, these are the questions that would have been asked on a multi-state networked examination. Because we are a state that, our examiners, when we're working with mortgage examinations, they're actually having to go in and they're removing upwards of 75 information requests for every exam. So that way they can send the company exactly what Kansas wants to send them for our single state. So we're also happy that industry has brought some of these concerns, and also very happy that the MMC and the whole group has identified these concerns and is so willing to act on those concerns here moving forward, and we look forward to that. I also want to point out that SES not only is just for mortgage examinations, it's for the consumer finance group. And on the flip side, for consumer finance, we actually didn't have any of the standard information requests loaded in there. So we're seeing a different approach by states where they're all adding single state, state specific information requests. And there's actually been a development group initiated there that is working on developing some standards for the consumer finance side as well. So that way those states can utilize standards and no longer have to have so many state specific information requests on their examinations. So that way we can make a little more uniformed approach everywhere across multiple industries. As far as the SES Steering Committee goes, the development with SES and the feedback that we receive on SES is taken very seriously, and we appreciate it very much. Every month we are meeting to discuss any feedback items. We're talking about any ways that we can improve the system for industry and the regulators, and identify those sort of areas where there might be some functionality issues that might cause the state to ask for you to submit your information request, multiple ways, when really it should just be one way. Just speaking from experience with SES, starting out, we were getting some feedback that companies weren't able to upload large documents or responses that might require multiple documents. So the functionality was developed for states to be able to input, one of their share file or similar software links into the information request area, so that way those items could be uploaded there. But we do understand the concern, and we're hopeful that we can build some functionality to help improve the system for others moving forward.
Well, I will say that what I was really impressed with was when I had the issue with the one exam that was just so difficult. I mean, it looked to be 25 questions, but when all was said and done, it was actually 75 questions that I had to answer. And when I discussed it with Kyle, he reached out to that state immediately. Together, they reviewed what they were doing and how they were doing it. And it turned out that there were some improvements SES could make, and then there were improvements that the state could make. So that was my whole focus here of trying to bring this up, that there are ways that we can work together to make it better for everyone. And so I greatly appreciated how quickly, Kyle responded to that, how quickly the state responded to that. And that maybe if we look a little deeper, like you're doing with all your focus groups and working groups, that perhaps we can all get to a better place, on our 3rd anniversary next year.
Very well said, Cindy. Yes. And for those listening in from other industries, maybe consumer finance, debt, money service business, what I would say there is if you're on the agency side or the regulator side, know that if you and your colleagues get together and come up with standard information request lists and standard procedures, those kind of core components of an exam, that those can be put into SES and used nationwide. And that's really what we're going for, is that the more we can get agreement across the states on what questions these companies are getting asked and what procedures are being conducted, but most importantly, those questions that companies are getting asked, the more we can engineer smart solutions in SES to make it even easier for companies to quickly fill out those questionnaires and get those responses back to you, which helps them, but it also helps the regulatory process. That speeds everybody's lives up. You're not waiting for those responses. And it really only works if we can reach agreement on the questions we're asking. And of course, I don't think we're saying to you that we think 100% uniformity is ever achievable. We're a large country. We have lots of different laws and regulations that have to be examined for. And that's why SES does preserve that flexibility. But if we can get closer to 75%, 80% common ground questions, I think we'll have a real win for both regulators and companies.
Definitely agree.
That's great discussion. We do have a chat from Carrie Whitaker, and so we're going to post that here. What legal authority do states have to demand methods of delivery? I thought this was an interesting question, and it's something that we have discussed internally. And from Kansas's point, our law gives broad authority for collection of records, as do many states. It also gives us broad authority to determine how an application would be developed, what an annual report looks like, what information requests look like in other areas like an examination. So it gives that authority to the commissioner or director or whomever is leading the agency to determine how best to regulate under that statute. So I would say the regulatory authority is going to differ by state, and obviously the specific language that each legislature puts forth and codifies is going to differ. But we would generally use our authority to prescribe certain forms and information requests to conduct an examination. With that said, so using the system has been a request from many, not just regulators, but also industry, to uniformly regulate the industry, to bring things together, to use data more effectively, which the system is doing. Now, there's not connections with, loan origination systems and so forth, but maybe that's to come in the future, right? Maybe that's something in the future. These information requests are easier to populate because systems get better and they grow. But this is the first step, and it's a large one. But I think what we've done as a state, like I say, is use our broad authority to prescribe forms and information requests under the statute. Do others have comments to that?
I would just add that Washington has similar language about the required method of delivery. I don't have the language off the top of my head, but it's similar to what you discussed.
Any other final thoughts on SES? I don't see any other chats on point here to cover.
I could just add one thing. Cindy, earlier you discussed, a particular state not using the system. And, Washington, we're kind of a hybrid right now. We're slowly onboarding into the system, and that, we're getting there. We're working on it, but we just determined that was the best way for us with our personnel and, our exam cycle to slowly kind of onboard and transition. So you might be running into some of that too.
Right. And the more that the states on board, the easier it's going to get for all of us. And again, it was just fascinating to have two completely different experiences within the same system. So I'm really fortunate that I'm part of the IDWG working group, so I could voice these concerns. I was able to speak with Kyle and then present it to everyone, so that if other industry members that I haven't spoken to, which there are a lot, have the same issues, that at least I was able to be a conduit to present them today. So again, thank you very much. I do appreciate it.
So we do have one other chat that we have a couple minutes to cover. So we'll get that one posted here. So it asks if we have information requests can be sent in bulk, can we have the option to download the IRs in bulk? And I think maybe Cindy, you kind of mentioned this type of issue. So is that something, Kyle, that is coming down the pike, or something that's being considered in development updates?
Yeah, it is. I can speak to that. And not knowing quite what the question's getting at here, I'll give you kind of two answers. One, if you're just looking to be able to download the list of requests that the state agency sent you, you can do that now. There's a download option right from the information request details tab. You can hit that and it'll give it to you right in Excel. So that's for the requests that they're asking you. What Cindy has pointed out would be very useful is once you've completed all those questions and you've answered and you've added your comments and documents, to be able to download that so that you have, I presume, a record of what you said and how you answered it to your regulator. That is something we're looking at. We've recently added some features on the regulator side that are good views of that kind of information. And I think we ought to be able to engineer a quick, easy way for companies to be able to download that back out of the system if they need to for their records. So yes, we're certainly looking into that.
Great, thanks for that clarification. All right, well, if there are any final thoughts, I think we can move on. I want to say thank you to the panel for joining us. It was a great discussion. We appreciate and look forward to future discussions on this matter, on these topics. So Cindy, again, thank you for your submission and for representing the industry so well. It was very helpful to get your perspective on this, and we look forward to improvements in the future. Absolutely.
Thank you.
All right, well, with that, we will move on. We're going to take about a 5-minute break to set up digitally for our next panel. So bear with us and we will be back soon. And we're back. Thanks, everyone. Next up, we have a topic that's been discussed at each of the virtual Ombudsman meetings we've had. And it's no surprise that the pandemic and the remote work are still on our minds. 4 of this meeting's agenda submissions spoke to this issue. I've asked 3 of the submitters to participate in today's discussion, and they include Kobe Pruitt with the Mortgage Bankers Association, Bob Neamy with Bradley, and Michael Stidham with Rocket Mortgage. They will be joined by Max Zappia with the Minnesota Department of Commerce, 3 members of the NMLS Policy Committee, Aaron Van Anglen with the Idaho Department of Finance, Deborah Talius with the Washington Department of Financial Institutions, and Jed Bellman with Maryland's Office of the Commissioner of Financial Regulation. And everyone should be on video. Welcome. So, Kobe, would you like to go first? Cover your presentation?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Everyone who's joined us during the Ombudsman meeting. My name is Kobe Pruitt. I'm the Associate Director of State Government Affairs at the Mortgage Bankers Association. And I wanted to talk about remote work today, but I want to take a quick moment to thank all of the regulators who are joining us today. Again, this is one of the few times that we get to discuss these issues with you, face to face, but this time it's, again, going to be more digitally because we are in a pandemic. And I want to reiterate how helpful the regulator community has been in issuing remote work guidance for MLOs and allowing them to work from a remote location. This has been extremely helpful in allowing lenders to serve consumers in a manner that protects both the consumer and the LO. With each day, we are learning more about the virus, more about the science to combat it, including vaccines that have been released recently, and hopefully they will reduce the amount of the spread of infection. However, despite this remarkable progress made since the release of vaccines, the U.S. is still a world that's a part of a world that's experiencing pandemic, and COVID is far from over. The daily average for new COVID infections remains extremely high. The Washington Post recently said that the current daily average is still over 113,000 new cases per day. That's per day. And what is also of concern is that we're seeing that some states are not observing what we would say are hot spots because the entire state itself is experiencing the effects of the pandemic akin to the beginning of 2020, which is why MBA is urging all regulators who are on this call to consider extending their remote work guidance to the end of 2022. We applaud the regulators that have already kind of seen the writing on the wall with the Delta variant and the explosive cases of COVID, as well as the hospitalizations. Many regulators have already extended their guidance to the end of this year, as well as into 2022. Hopefully this will allow for limited exposure for LOs and consumers who are trying to continue with business during this difficult time. And more information and more steps are going to be needed so we can return safely. I think I would definitely say that some states have already recognized the severity of this, even when their own remote work guidance is scheduled to expire, in allowing their employees to continue working remotely. We as the industry would just encourage and ask that the same deference that is given to regulators and their employees is also afforded to the industry. In addition, MBA is of the opinion that the pandemic has really proven that it is possible for the industry to continue operating away from branch locations. We believe using the lessons learned from the pandemic and the best practices used to safeguard information, we believe it is time for states to consider looking at their own licensing laws and regulations that were likely created in a much different world in 2008 and modernize them to embrace innovation that's been achieved to allow LOs to serve consumers wherever they are, be it in a pandemic or during a natural disaster. State regulators, like some of the ones on this panel in Maryland and Washington, have already acted to modernize their state licensing laws. And we really thank you for taking those steps to see that innovation is happening in the industry and allowing for MLOs to serve consumers however they may do in a way that's flexible to the industry. We would also, as MBA, like to offer our help to the regulators on the call who are considering modernizing their law to allow us to share with you best practices, as well as a model law and regulation that we developed in conjunction with Bradley and Bob, who's on the call, to allow for a more seamless transition to a world where we can work remotely. So that's what I came here to share. I'll stick around for questions, obviously, at the end. But again, we encourage you to extend your guidance out to 2022, as well as consider looking at your laws and modernizing them for the future.
Thank you, Kobe. Really appreciate that. Bob, would you like to go next and talk about your submission?
Certainly, Jim. Confirm you can hear me okay? Great. Well, certainly good afternoon to everybody, and thank you to Jim, our NMLS Ombudsman, now for our third virtual meeting during your tenure. Talk about unforeseen. But also thank you to the entire team at CSBS for the work done to make these Ombudsman meetings still happen and allow us to have the opportunity to discuss. But also quick thank you to both Kobe Pruitt of MBA and Mike Stidham of Rocket for focusing on similar issues to mine today. So my name is Bob Nemi. I'm a non-lawyer with Bradley Arant Bolt Cummings. I'm a senior advisor for regulatory compliance. Contact information, if anybody, like Kobe said, certainly here to help if anybody has questions or concerns. Afterwards, my contact information is in the letter I submitted. Letter and discussion today is about branch licensing. While we certainly need to learn from this extended work from home period and what it's shown us, we also need to realize that this discussion for branch licensing is not new. The 18 months have certainly been a test of our abilities to adapt and survive while serving our customers. How we can move forward with this knowledge gained is up to each one of us. But again, the conversation has not begun because of the pandemic. The discussion on the future of branch licensing and the flexibility began more than 2 years ago. But for today's meeting, I certainly understand that they are interdependent topics. Kobe's letter from the MBA position states, state licensed companies have proven in this national health crisis that they can operate in a new paradigm where they can remotely serve consumers effectively while respecting important consumer and data protection rules. I'll take that one step more. I think state regulators have also proven that they can operate during the same crisis and they can supervise in the same new paradigm of remote work. The implementation of remote work shows the ability of both industry and regulators to adapt and perform essential services. As Kobe mentioned, the MBA team from Bradley, Hayden Richards, Amy Rose, and myself coordinated a 9-week discussion among 32 industry professionals to prepare model language for state regulators to consider. We shared our product with the MBA, committee members who reviewed, approved, and endorsed the efforts. And then we also shared it with the ARMOR board, ARMOR members, CSBS staff, and of course, our Ombudsman, Jim Payne. While the model language was built upon a request from last September's Ombudsman meeting, the concepts that we presented were not necessarily new. The 4 concepts we looked at in the letter and we continue to discuss, the removal of brick and mortar in-state branching requirements, elimination of requirements that mandate that all work must be performed only from a licensed location, removal of the commutable distance requirements for both originators and managers, and that all licensees are responsible for their MLOs they sponsor and the people they employ. While regulatory agencies have extended leniency with respect to remote work during the pandemic, industry needs regulators to implement this flexibility on a permanent basis. Unfortunately, there will be future needs and disasters. Emergencies will happen, and our collective preparation will be tested by the next flood, the next wildfire, hurricane, or worse, yet another pandemic. Mike Stidham's letter points out that there are natural disaster extreme weather conditions that may create barriers for mortgage loan originators to continue their work and prevent customers access to essential financial services that they need. How can we build upon what we've learned, find a reasonable middle ground, and move forward with both preparation and understanding in mind? Whenever and wherever possible, we urge state regulators to reimagine branch licensing and authorize work from a remote location when under the supervision and oversight of their employer. Consumer expectations and company supervision have evolved since state codes were written many years ago. Company preparation and oversight has also evolved to protect digital assets and ensure compliance as well as consumer protections. Consumer expectations have evolved beyond the 9-to-5 world with the online and digital world where literally the loan process is in the palm of their hand via a smart phone application. So when possible, and your current state statutes allow, work with MBA members and conduct collaborative discussions about future branch licensing. We commit to work with your in-state mortgage banker teams, licensed companies, and find reasonable allowances and work within the system to resolve these questions. Does work from a licensed location benefit the consumer? Is a licensed location necessary to supervision? Does a licensee have the ability to supervise their employee while working, remote or otherwise? And how will a reduction in branch licensing impact state regulator budgets? Certainly now is the time for industry and regulators to join, and I call for both ARMOR and CSBS leadership to facilitate these discussions. One last point that came up yesterday in a discussion from my friend Danielle from AFSA, reminder that these issues exist beyond mortgage. So please consider how these issues impact other licensed lenders within your states as well. Again, thank you for the opportunity to present these topics and ideas. I look forward to the discussion. And if there are any requests to see some of the model language or additional points, I'll point out that Kobe did have the link to the model language as well as other FAQs at the bottom of page 1 in his letter, which is also attached to the agenda. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate hearing from you as always. And our final industry representative is Michael Stidham with Rocket Mortgage. Michael?
Can everyone hear me okay? Thank you. So first and foremost, my name is Mike Stidham. I'm the Director of Regulatory Affairs here at Rocket Mortgage. I got to keep remembering to say Rocket Mortgage. We used to be Quicken Loans forever. I'd like to thank Ombudsman Payne and the CSBS for the opportunity to be on the agenda. Thank you. I also want to thank Kobe Pruitt from the MBA and Bob Nemi from Bradley for their comments around remote work. The COVID-19 pandemic has really redefined the concept of remote work in ways that were previously unimaginable. You know, looking back at what's been accomplished with the way industry made the changes to their operations demonstrates it can be done with thoughtful oversight and collaboration between regulators and industry. You know, there's been states that have made the necessary regulatory and or legislative changes to allow permanent remote work. And for those states, I say thank you. You know, it's these types of changes that allow industry to continue the service needed and expected by the consumers without interruption. And Bob, you just noted a moment ago that, you know, we've been witness to a lot of crazy things like natural disasters and wildfires and hurricanes and flooding that can prevent the MLO from getting to their licensed location to serve their clients, right? Allowing mortgage origination activity to be performed remotely provides the much needed flexibility to ensure consumers' access to their MLO is uninterrupted. The way the MLOs interact with their clients has changed significantly over the last 20 years, and I think we can all agree to that. You know, the days of a consumer meeting with their MLO face-to-face with pay stubs, W-2s, tax returns in hand is done and gone. You know, with proper safeguards and oversight by a sponsoring entity, an MLO should be able to accommodate any consumer on their own terms. Sponsoring entities will need to ensure policies and procedures are in place to safeguard the security and the privacy of consumers' non-public personal information. So with that being said, I'd like to raise the following 2 questions. Question number 1 is within 2021, we've seen a lot of positive movement in permanently allowing remote work from remote locations. You know, COVID-19 has provided a great business case to show it can be done. But the use cases for allowing remote work, they go beyond the pandemic. We've seen some states quickly make the changes needed to allow work from a remote location and would like to understand how they were able to accomplish this. And then my second question, we feel allowing work from a remote location should be part of business continuity plans, and sponsoring entities should meet a set of standards. And I think Bob spoke about those a moment ago as well. Many states face extreme weather or disasters that can prevent licensees from being able to get to their license offices. I'd like to know today, if possible, are there any other states considering these changes? And how can industry help support implementing the needed changes? Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. To frame the discussion, we've got several regulator attendees as well. Some have addressed the remote work, and everyone's addressed it in some form or fashion. The ways differ, obviously, as much as our laws and individual structures differ. Who would like to go off first to say just a little brief explain how your state in particular addressed the remote work issue? We could start off with that.
Hi, this is Deborah. I'm happy to go ahead and get started because I think in part I can kind of respond to Michael's last point with kind of how did it happen, because Washington is one of the states that I believe we were to a fair degree responsive to the pandemic and changes in remote work. But it wasn't something that happened overnight. It did require some work and some legwork in advance. So just to kind of start off, prior to the pandemic, Washington State did have a branch licensing requirement, and that did include MLOs who were working from home. However, that did change over the pandemic. It started with regard to the temporary work from home back in March 5 of 2020 was the first time that we issued some guidance that allowed MLOs to work from home. The guidance has now been extended, I think, 4 times in the course of the last year and a half, and now runs through December 31 of 2021. However, it was before the pandemic that we actually started to explore expanding work from home options for MLOs. And in fact, we started doing industry surveys either late 2018 or 2019. And our surveys really focused on technology use. So just to kind of give you a little insight into what Washington was thinking at that time. So our survey questions related to information security policies, how data and records are stored both electronically and physically, how employees access data, VPN usage, cloud usage, those sorts of things. And so you can really see that our focus at that time was looking to ensure that that consumers' information is protected. We all want that. We all want consumer protections in place, regulatory requirements being met, so on and so forth. So that was really where we were focusing. I think we're all on the same page with that. So there was some legwork that took time. And so ultimately in 2020 and 2021, we drafted and proposed legislation to eliminate the requirement for MLOs to work, to license their home as branches. So again, I think the survey started back in 2019. So it definitely did take some time. And I will also note that we were only looking at removing the requirement for MLOs homes to be a licensed location. We're not and are not at this point even looking at removing branch licensing altogether. And I think that may be in part, again, going back to the information security piece. Like I said, the legislation was passed this year. It became effective of July 25 of this year. After the passage of that legislation, we started to look at doing some rule writing, primarily with regard, again, to kind of cybersecurity, information security. We actually started doing some stakeholder engagement on that. However, at this point, our rule writing has been discontinued because we're looking at more global, uniform, all industry cybersecurity legislation. And we wanted to make sure that any rule writing we did wouldn't contradict any sort of legislation that may be forthcoming. So at this point, we have no plans for rule writing at this time. I will note, however, though, that the interim guidance, I was actually just informed that the interim guidance that we have out, we will be extending through 2020. And again, even though we have this legislation, the reason why we feel as though we need to continue to extend the guidance is to address some cyber provisions that now, of course, we didn't do in the rule writing. So those cyber provisions that are in our guidance will continue to be in effect. So I will.
And what was the date again? The extension date?
So our guidance extension will be through 2020, so December 31, 2020.
Like you 2020 last year?
I'm sorry, 2022. I apologize.
Oh, okay. No, that's kind of what I thought you were saying, 2022. Okay.
Yeah, I was trying to, but failed. Thank you for clarifying.
No problem. Yeah.
Well, Jim, I'll jump in.
Yes, please.
So we understand that this is an industry-wide issue from all of our regulated space. I'll start with MLO since we confronted this issue several years ago. I think we recognize that with the advancement of technology and the implementation of risk-based supervision and the functional areas that we started supervising through the good work led by the MMC, the risks associated and the fact that technology had made it very easy for MLOs to work more remotely, we allowed for flexibility in origination by location, frankly, years ago. And coming into the pandemic, when we started talking to other industries about the issues surrounding branch licensing or licensing and working from a licensed location, it played well with the good work that we had done before the pandemic, giving flexibility to MLOs. And so I think it was the debt collection space that first came to us, but we worked with other industries like MBA and AFSA to think through what would be a long-term solution. And so we promulgated emergency regulations, I believe late last year, early this year, to permanently, to start with the emergency regulations to allow for remote work for all employees of licensed entities, to as long as you met certain standards around supervision, the type of location, so it doesn't smell like a business location, and then obviously IT security and privacy protocols that meet the modern expectation given the risk of the entity that the person works for. And we made that permanent earlier this year, and we think it's a good solution. That leads into Bob's kind of comments around branch location and how we license and supervise. I think that a lot of our laws were drafted during the time when brick and mortar was much more a real thing. And as we know, and that's not to knock brick and mortar, I think that there's still brick and mortar value, but we've seen how technology has disrupted, the classic financial services. And so as we think through the development of, the key individual and control and risk and those functions that actually are the kind of the hub of all decision making, where the risk really flows from, I think I think it's important for regulators to think through how we supervise and maybe think more of it holistically around entity and less around individual locations and things of that nature. So hopefully the first step from our regulation is a broader conversation about how we as regulators supervise entities we regulate, excuse me.
Thank you, Jed. So how about Minnesota and Idaho? How have you addressed it?
I can jump in. I represent the It's Better to Be Lucky Than Good group on this matter, in that our laws and statutes didn't require any real changes. That being said, up until the pandemic, I don't believe this is anything we formally addressed. When the pandemic kicked off, we were able to put out guidance specific to the pandemic. However, thanks to Mark Hasty's leadership, as we went deeper and deeper into last year, we got requests to clarify our position long term, and we were able to do that.
Very good. Aaron?
Similar to Maryland and Washington, we've actually addressed the telecommuting of loan originators probably several years before the pandemic even began. So our guidance for COVID-19 really was just more of a reminder to supervise those individuals and make sure that we have that cybersecurity and the information security in place. But our loan originators, we do have a telecommuting policy. They've always been able to operate under that policy if they choose to do so, and the company will allow them to do so. I kind of want to talk a little bit about, with the branch licensing. I think that the states are willing to have a conversation. At least that's what I've heard from them. A lot of states are willing to have that conversation, but I think, as Bob recognized in his letter, there are times where we face a regulatory hurdle with our legislatures and trying to get that information passed. And so it might take some time, but I don't think that the states are unwilling to have that conversation.
And I think, Aaron, just to jump on that, if industry values this as a real meaningful solution that is cost saving, more efficient, more effective, we need you as partners if we were to move to implement this, because it does, you take out, a lot of fees that fund our offices are tied to branches. Doesn't mean that's the most effective way to budget, but those type of changes needs, we need to work hand in hand, lockstep, to show both the legislature and policymakers that this isn't a controversial change, but just an effective way to modernize, allowing us to continue to operate and not burdening industry in a way that's inappropriate. So,
yeah, I would agree with that, Jed. And we have some personal experience here in our state changing fees. Thankfully, over a decade ago, we did change the fee structure to allow more of an assessment fee. So we've got a mix of different things that we can do. So we can change the assessment to base it on our budget and rely less on branch fees. But we recognize not every state is in that boat. So where industry can help and support, where and it is legislative, a conservative legislature looks at a fee increase and says this is not good. But you're saying, well, I'm trying to offset the fee. We're going to lower this one and on the branch side and up it on the whatever the volume fee or however it gets passed. That's definitely going to be needed. From Kansas's point, I will just quickly say we had a longstanding policy that said you have to be within a commutable commutable distance from your branch location. We did away with that during COVID, and now we've permanently done away with that with some guidance and used existing statute language that said working at or from a branch. And we said, because they use those two terms, at or from, we were going to expand on that and say, well, we know what at means, that's physically there. From, that's a little bit more gray. So we said, well, from can mean remote, if these set in, if it's safe, if it's overseen, et cetera. So we drafted that policy. Now we realize that that's temporary and it's a little bit uncertain because new administration, they can change, they can look at it another way. So we do want to have some statutory changes, and we're looking to do those as soon as next year. And we are looking to nod to AFSA and others on non-mortgage. We are looking to different laws as well, because we do have some consumer branches in our state too that need to be addressed, because it's an equal burden, it's an equal risk in terms of the pandemic. And but there remote work is being done in multiple industries, so we're trying to recognize that as well. We've got about a minute left. This has been a great discussion. Does anybody have any final thoughts that Burning want to go cover?
So I think Michael raised, and I think you said, the most important thing is you're responsible for your employees, and we're supervising you. I mean, when we implemented the mortgage loan originator piece several years ago, tied to that was a regulation that made clear that the mortgage lender is responsible for all aspects of supervising, training, and being accountable for the activity of their employees. And so, we have all the tools and power to enforce, and discipline the license for the misconduct of employees. And so I think some flexibility, as long as we demonstrate standards and accountability and expect accountability from the licensee, should be good enough for states to hopefully create some flexibility for employees that work from home.
If I could just add in,
and I would also say, okay, Bob.
I was going to say, Kobe and I are certainly willing to have these discussions. Certainly appreciate the states that have made openings, revisions, edits to administrative code, to statutory code. We understand the way it happens. We understand that not everybody's going to do it, and we're not asking for a change of the rules for what's required to supervise employees or the consumer protections that are out there that exist today, just to allow them to operate in a new environment.
Just to add one quick negative thing, it does. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was slightly late. I just want to add one thing at the end of what Bob said is also, I just want to make sure people understand that the emergency, the need for temporary, for guidance on remote work is not going to necessarily end with the end of the pandemic. We still need it for natural disasters. We still need it for when, a consumer has some disabilities, cannot travel. So there are other reasons that exist for remote work, and it's just not the pandemic. So I want to make sure people are not in the mindset that, we don't have to change anything just because, the pandemic may be wrapping up, but from what we've seen, it's not. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Max.
I actually have a final thought for us, then we have to go.
So this probably sucks as a final thought, but I was just going to point out that cyber risk should be at the top of everyone's kind of risk assessment of their institution, and this does make it worse. That being said, every employer here has accepted that over the last year, but it's worth noting.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much to the entire panel. This has been a great discussion. I'm sorry we have to go and move on to the rest of our agenda, but I hope to further these discussions. Let's talk more at the NMLS conference. Let's talk at the next Ombudsman meeting, and let's get together to tackle this issue. So thank you all so much for being on the panel. So we're going to go to have another 5-minute break to reset again digitally for the next topic, and we will be right back. All right, hello everyone. Thanks for bearing with us again during our digital transitions. Next, we will hear from Keisha Whitehall-Wolf with Miles and Stockbridge on some of the industry's concerns with the Model Money Transmission Modernization Act. Keisha will be joined by Devin Phelps with the Washington Department of Financial Institutions, Gus Avocados also with Miles and Stockbridge, Kara Kuhar with the Schulte and Roth and Gable, and Adam Fleischer with Cooley. Both of those two were members of the Regulator and Industry Clearinghouse that worked on the act. I've also got Matt Lambert and Janine Bjorn with the CSBS to join us. So if everybody should be on video, and we'll go ahead and get started. Keisha, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jim, and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having us. It's a pleasure to be included in these discussions with the Ombudsman, so we really appreciate it. Our topic pertains to the Msd Model law, and I again want to say we appreciate the combined efforts of both the industry and the regulators in crafting the Uniform Money Transmission Modernization Act. It's known by a couple different names, such as the Money Transmitter Model Law, the Money Services Business Law, and the CSBS Model Money Transmission Modernization Act. I may use any one of those or the act as we speak, but this is what we're referring to. It has been our understanding that the act, which was recently approved and made public by the CSBS Board of Directors, is intended to be a single set of nationwide standards and requirements that state legislatures will be encouraged to enact. In fact, in part, the stated purpose of the act is to eliminate unnecessary regulatory burden and more effectively utilize regulator resources, which is a great goal. Although the Msd Model law only applies to money services businesses, during a recent presentation to industry attendees at the 2021 NTR virtual conference, CSBS administrators publicly discussed the common requirements found within the Msd Model law, and that they are currently being built into the functional components of NMLS in connection with NMLS modernization. Additionally, the model law will serve as the basis for the development of core data requirements for all licensees and applicants that are processed through NMLS, including certain persons who have direct or indirect control over the licensee. To that end, I want to note that Section 504 of the model law sets forth information requirements for certain individuals. And that includes individuals in control of a licensee or an applicant, any individual that seeks to acquire control of a licensee, and each key individual. So what does that mean? Unless the individual currently resides outside the United States and has resided outside the United States for the last 10 years, these individuals must provide fingerprints for the purposes of a criminal history background check, personal history and experience, an independent credit report, information related to criminal convictions and pending charges, and information related to any regulatory or administrative action, and certain civil litigations. So the Act provides that these items must be provided to the regulator through NMLS. So among other terms in the Model Act, and Shannon, would you please show the definitions? You'll see that there are definitions for key individuals and for control. So the definition of key individual under the Msd Model law focuses on individuals responsible for policymaking and managerial responsibilities for the applicant or for the licensee.
Keisha,
yes,
sorry to interrupt. For folks on the phone, you can double click the screen and get a wider view. Go ahead, Keisha.
Okay, thank you. So this definition for key individual is a relatively new concept, but it's been consistently shared on various NMLS discussions as a new initiative within the NMLS modernization efforts. However, there's also the definition of control. And the definition of control is significantly more expansive than that which is currently required for license types and other than MSBs. So control is defined as the power to vote directly or indirectly at least 25% of the outstanding voting shares or voting interest of a licensee or a person in control of a licensee. B, it's the power to elect or appoint a majority of key individuals or executive officers, managers, directors, trustees, or other persons exercising managerial authority of a person in control of a licensee, or the power to exercise directly or indirectly a controlling influence over the management or policies of a licensee or a person in control of a licensee. We are concerned that the plain language of this definition of control would reach not only those persons directly or indirectly influencing the licensee, but it would also reach persons in control of entities that control the licensee. So before I provide a visual aid to show you what I mean, I'd like to take a brief pause to note that since we submitted our written comments to the inclusion of today's agenda, we now understand that there are certain aspects of the Msd Model law, including the definition of control, that had been initially drafted by the National Conference of Commissioners on Uniform State Laws. And they were a part of the Money Services Act of 2000. Shannon, would you scroll up for us, please? You would go to that chart with the, so it's a little large, but this basically shows that kind of that timeline of where that definition of control came from. And so on the far side, you'll see kind of under the initial Banking Act where that started, that was then implemented into the Uniform Money Services Act in 2000 with some additions. And over time, some states have adopted the act, some with, as the definition played out before. Others adopted the definition of control with some changes to it. And then finally, and I believe there are about 10 or 12 states who adopted that Uniform Act. And now today we have the language as proposed by CSBS. So there is some history there. So over the approximately 20 years that definition has been in control, that definition has been around, we did speak to some of the states regarding the definition, and while they have not historically enforced the language that I'm going to describe at the end of that, it's my understanding that as we spoke to them about it, they saw some of the ramifications of the plain interpretation of the language, and basically said that the interpretation was not contemplated in their initial adoption, and I dare say perhaps not desired as we spoke about it. Sharon, would you move forward just a little bit, please? So I'll ask everyone to kind of walk through this with me. The definition of control introduces the term controlling influence we spoke about. It's not a defined term in the Act, but commentary found in the Act states that a person does not have the power to exercise a controlling influence if the person does not participate in the day-to-day decisions or operations of a licensee or person in control of a licensee. So here's a sample licensing chart. And with this, we will assume from that definition of controlling influence, each entity must have at least one individual who participates in the day-to-day decisions of the entity. This definition of control would then reach at least one individual for each and every entity in the ownership chain. So based on a 10% control threshold that exists under any mortgage or consumer licensing law, we prepared the sample. And it's to illustrate the number of additional individuals that would be subject to vetting under the Act, under the definition of control. And so with that, you'll see as you go up the chain, at each point, there is someone who may have a controlling influence. And so from the licensee to the new parent, to ABC acquisition, and up the chain, up to the funds at the top and the publicly traded. There is, under that definition, there is going to be someone who may have a controlling interest there and a controlling influence, which under our definition of control under the Act would mean that we would be disclosing those individuals in the system. Additionally, this chart assumes that it's a single individual. But as you walk through the definition, it is very possible and probable that there is more than one person at each level who may have to be disclosed. That is certainly an increase in the number of disclosures from what we currently have today. And I think that's an increase both for licensees and for regulators. So with those increases, the Act also includes a rebuttable presumption of control. So it seems to us that there may have been a desire to limit the number of persons that are ultimately to be disclosed. However, a person is presumed to be exercising a controlling influence when the person holds the power to vote directly or indirectly at least 10% of the outstanding voting shares or voting interests of a licensee or a person in control of a licensee. And alternatively, certain persons are presumed to exercise a controlling influence, but can rebut that presumption of control if the person is a passive investor. And what does that mean? Well, if we scroll forward, in the comments to the model law in 2020, they were published with those comments a passive investor attestation form. Maybe scroll up to that, please, Shannon. Thank you. And on that form, this is a copy of that form. with that, they are 4 items that must be attested to in order to be considered a passive investor who is then exempt from having to be disclosed on the form as a person with controlling interests. And as you go through that, the individual has to swear that they does not have the power to vote directly or indirectly 10% or more of the class of voting securities, and that of the licensee or a person in control of the licensee. They also have to say, I do not have the power to elect a majority of the executive officers, managers, directors, trustees, or other persons exercising managerial control of the licensee or a person in control of the licensee. That the individual is not employed by and does not have any managerial duties of the licensee or a person in control of a licensee. And for the prior 2 items, it is possible for that person to pass those. They may have no voting power, they cannot elect the persons. But for number 3, we believe it's going to be a fail, because although the individual does not have managerial duties of the licensee, an officer may be employed by and or have managerial duties for a person that's a 10% owner of the licensee. And then we go on to number.
With that, Keisha, sorry, I just can we stop for a little bit and talk about that before we move on?
Sure.
Okay. So I just wanted to give an opportunity for others to join in and talk about a little bit of the control definition as part of the wider act and the model law that's been presented. So Matt Lambert worked very heavily and still does in this space and on this act, and I wanted to give you the opportunity to say some words.
Thank you. So I think some background might be helpful in the history for how we got here. You showed a bunch of control definitions on the screen, and there are 40 more in the state system. If you had the 10 or so Uniform Money Services Act control definitions. So it's a heck of a challenge to figure out exactly what that definition should be, given the discrepancy among the states currently. So we had 3 kind of high-level objectives. One was to keep it simple. We could just go to Regulation Y. They updated it in 2020. They have a massive structure for determining what a controlling interest is and looks like. We could have adopted that, but we know that would have been very difficult in practice to implement and probably more than needs to happen. So how do we keep it simple? 2, we wanted to utilize precedent. So just because the current Reg Y is complicated and probably more than is needed doesn't mean that we should throw out 60 years of precedent for control, because we know that, at least in money transmission, the concept of control relates back to Regulation Y and the Bank Holding Company Act. And that is one thing that all members of the Conference of State Bank Supervisors know and understand, because at our core, this is the regulatory group for banking supervisors. Yes, money transmission goes outside of banking departments in a couple states, but by and large, that's our membership and what they're familiar with. And then 3, we knew from the FinTech Industry Advisory Panel that we needed to make sure we had a consistent approach to recognizing passive investors. Conveniently, Regulation Y has a means of doing that in the rebuttable presumption of control, which also provided the balance we needed when you look at the 50 different sets of control definitions, where we have 25% in some states, we have 10% in others. Heck, we have a 15% state out there. So we knew that if we could rely on something that everybody understands, like Regulation Y and banking standards, and tweak it to fit money transmission, we'd have a good shot of getting that uniformity. Fortunately, the Uniform Law Commission, and under their previous name, had done that 2 decades ago with the Uniform Money Services Act. The definitions in front of you are more or less verbatim from the Uniform Money Services Act. And if you read their commentary, that they looked to Regulation Y to make theirs. So those were kind of the three high-level goals for what we were setting out to do. And as you dive into it, you see that there are 10, a dozen or so states that currently have these definitions on their books. And probably thousands of applications have gone through with those definitions in place without any nightmare scenarios of having to bring forth a full slate of directors and executive officers 10 rungs up the corporate ladder. So we know from experience that the reading is not this worst case scenario. So having said that, we know that a plain reading can be read to look like that. So the question is, how do we make sure that we stay true to this intent to utilize the appropriate standards of control that we came up with without it snowballing into some sort of everybody needs a criminal background check. It doesn't matter where you are in the organizational hierarchy. I'll pause there in case anybody else wants to add something.
Understand why after 10, 12 years of licensing companies nationwide, each state has licensed companies, you will look to federal regulations to determine how you should define control. So why would you look at federal regulations when you have the state laws? Every state has a law that they've been working on for any number of years. Why look to federal regulations to pull a definition of control which reaches a person who controls a licensee?
Because this is in the state law currently and has been for 2 decades.
But of the states, a few states go to the person that controls a licensee. Most states do not, and they've operated under that definition for as long as NMLS has been in existence without any problems. Did you identify a problem with licensing companies and existing laws in most of the states to suggest that there would be a reason to change the definition of control? I don't think you've done that work.
Well, part of the issue, I would say, Gus, is that we are trying to get states to operate uniformly. That's part of the issue. So if you've got a handful of states that are operating with the indirect control and they're going to be disclosed, we need every state to work with the same record. The core requirements, that was the idea, is that if you're going to give individuals and have them vetted and put into the system, that each state gets the same view.
I would also say that right now, the multi-state MSB licensing agreement, which is adopted and used by about 30 states, we're using this essentially as it's written. The proposal is written without the ability to rebut the presumption. And again, we've been doing this for, I think the MMLA has been going on for about 3 years. We have never asked for, anyone 5 rungs up the chain that is a director unless there would be some reason to do so. So, well, we do understand your concerns about a plain reading. I don't think we haven't seen it. We haven't seen it. And then like Matt said, we've been using this definition for over 20 years for several states under UMSA. And I don't think we've ever seen it either, even before the MMLA program.
And I can certainly
just add, participating on the RICH panel in those discussions, it was never the intent of sort of reworking the definition or sort of drafting the model law to create a requirement that officers and directors of holding companies up the chain all need to be vetted. It was really a desire to harmonize all the different definitions of control that we currently have across the states in the MSB industry, and then to create a mechanism to rebut control at 10%, which only exists in some of the states. But we didn't want to bring the threshold all the way down to 10 and require everyone basically at 10 to have to be deemed a control party. So we wanted to get in that rebuttable presumption of control that currently only exists in a couple of states. So right now we have a situation where if you have an investor coming in at say 12% way up the chain, you have a change of control that needs to be approved in certain states, but not others. You could rebut it in 2, but you can't in say 8 others. And so you end up with a change of control process. So we were trying to harmonize something. That was kind of the intent behind the rebuttable presumption, was to make a uniform way to do this, so it would be easier for companies to get capital in and have investors come in that really intend it to be passive at, you know, a 15% level that wouldn't have to go through the change of control process.
Well, first of all, I'm not sure why you're all buying down to having everything uniform throughout the states, throughout the country. A few states, they go to indirect owners, and it's more problematic, and companies can choose to whether to go and make loans in those jurisdictions. But most states do not go that far. So I'm not sure why you chose a harder route to adopt as a model state law, as opposed to one of the parameters in most of the jurisdictions. So you've still seem you've gone well beyond what most of the states currently require.
If I may just add to that, I certainly hear what you're saying in terms of the fact that the law had been around for 20 years. I think the concern beyond, for purposes of this discussion, it's not the 25% or the 10% that is concerning, but it is the additional language at the end, that clause which requires a person in control of the licensee to also be added to that vetting list. I think in terms of taking a look at it, your language already says you want a direct or indirect person, you've identified them, and now you've added this additional language, which the other states who have been, some of them who've had this within their language for the past 20 years have indicated they had not used, and they had not looked at it in that way. With the changes and modernization coming to NMLS, you are now going to have this language is going to be built into the system. So at a base level, each person coming to the system to apply is going to be looking at this language to determine whether or not individuals within their corporate structures need to be disclosed. And whether or not state regulators today are looking for that to happen, as we look at the language and you do the plain reading of the language, I am going to have to advise my clients as we walk through it that those are the individuals that need to be placed in the system. Right now,
well, I do want to say to that, Keisha, I just wanted to say to that we also have other industries that will come on board after MSB, but that this act is about MSBs. So yes, the system needs to function to regulate this act, but there will be further discussions about other industries as it relates to their use of the system.
And my understanding as it currently is yes, this is an act for MSBs. But what has been disclosed thus far is that this information that I have for MSBs is the information that is being used to build the system, to build the functionality for modernization that will be the core data to be used by all licensees, not just MSBs. So although the language is here for MSBs, the system is going to drive the usage for all licensees.
Right, yeah. I could ask Janine to kind of speak to the Key Individual Wizard Initiative.
Sure, sure. So the Key Individual Wizard, which I hope you're all familiar with, is really agnostic to industry. It is being built to accommodate the model law in that we're building in a screen to capture the rebuttable presumption test that is outlined in the model law. I maintain that the rebuttable presumption test it's obviously the antithesis of a definition of control. The notion of a passive investor, we believe that is also germane to other industries because it really is just the opposite of somebody that has control. Also, as far as owner entities, so basically how the Kiwi is going to deal with this is once an owner entity, if they have not rebutted the presumption of control, so they are deemed an owner entity that has control, or they own more than 25%, because there is no rebuttable presumption there, the wizard would take you to a screen and ask if there are any individuals at that owner entity level that have the power to exercise a controlling influence over the management or policies of the applicant. It is not, which is really what is the common practice today, how states today are interpreting this language that we do have in the model law. So I think that should help.
So they would have to answer affirmatively or negatively to that question, and that would drive whether or not they're going to be disclosed as a control person.
Right, because basically after you get to this screen, you will have already gone through the vast majority of the wizard, where you've identified your ownership, you've identified your management, you've identified your key individuals in the functional areas, which are deemed control individuals, now known as key individuals. And then once you go through all that, it will take you to this other screen for owner entities that own more than 25% of the applicant, or those that own between 10 and 25 that cannot rebut the presumption. And then it would ask if there's any other individuals at these owner entities that have the power to exercise a controlling influence over the applicant.
Which they don't have to do today.
Sorry?
Senior people or officers at those companies that may control a licensee would have to submit certain disclosures we don't have to do today. So for years, the system is operating. Is it broken? I don't hear it's broken. States are comfortable with licensing companies that they have been doing for any number of years. It may not be the intent behind that language, but there's nothing in this document about the language that shows what the intent should be. We just have the plain language on what you're going to rely. You have to write information about a person in control of the licensee. It takes us well beyond what most of the states have done today. So I hear what you're saying, how you're going to do it, how you do this on the Kiwi system, but we go beyond that. The question is, I don't think we need this language. It hasn't been needed to date. Why all of a sudden has it become a necessity to vet the person that may control a licensing? I'm not hearing anything.
Or at least to disclose them completely, because with that language, not only is the licensee now responsible for making sure that they have identified all those people, whether or not the state decides to vet them, they now have to disclose them onto the system, and the regulators now have to take a look at that list and say, yay or nay, or do we want, the regulator now has to determine whether they want to continue to vet them. They have to determine whether have they been disclosed timely. So I think they would have to be updated if they change. And so for that person, I think you would get to what the regulators are looking for, it seems, through the language that's already in the statute, which is that direct or indirect language. But that last clause relating to a person in control of the licensee, I think that with the plain reading of that, it gives it on the front end, these individuals need to be disclosed. And I don't know how you get around that, even with your presumptive, the form of the presumption in the attestation. Even with that, the person who is employed may not be employed by the company, and they may not have managerial duties at the licensee level, but that person is in control of a licensee. And so they may, through their duties at a higher level of ownership, and you fail there, so most of them will have to be disclosed. So you do get more disclosure, whether or not the state ultimately decides to vet them in some further way. And so I am not saying that this language has not been around. I think with Kiwi coming into play as you added, I think it's going to put a greater emphasis on that. And because we do not have the additional guardrails today to say, this was our intent, at some later point, there's going to be an examiner or a regulator who then says, Well, that's not what it says. It says you need to disclose the person who is in control of a licensee. And so you're going to have that. And beyond this, if this language then goes to state legislatures for adoption, they again don't have your intent. And so that whatever is adopted by state legislatures may or may not be what's currently in the model law. What we're asking today is just to give some additional thought to this before we move forward with it and push it out to the states directly. If there is a way to just limit that portion, even just removing that clause, maybe a suggestion to allow the regulators to get to the intent of what they want and to give some guidance for future use of the law.
Thank you for that. Janine, we did have one follow-up question on Kiwi. So I'm going to ask that be posted and see if we can answer this question in the chat. So they're agreeing with Keisha that the modernized system will impose further reach than current regulations. Are there controls within Kiwi to keep confidential information of various individuals only visible to states that have language which captures them?
I'm not really sure what this person is asking, but the confidentiality provisions, within the system will remain just as they are today. So I'm not sure what they're asking. There will be controls, but just like there are today for confidential
Okay, so I think the
information.
controls maybe that they might be getting at is if they're applying in one state and not another, the end of confidential information will be given to the state they're applying in, perhaps, rather than to another state that they're not applying in. That may be the question, but again,
I'm not
sure
sure what
exactly.
there's, so the wizard's going to drive the identification of what we're calling core information. So
Right.
the wizard will drive, in essence, one, your ownership chart, your ownership hierarchy. It's going to drive the identification of management, just like you identify those individuals in your record today. And it's going to drive the identification of key individuals that will then be populated in your record, or your what we call our MU form today. Does that
Okay.
help?
Yes. Yeah, and this is a follow-up from the same person.
So in the model law, which we're that's our standard that we're building to. Basically, it will require that every applicant identify those owners that own 10% or more of the applicant. And as we said before, those owners that own between 10 and 25% will be able to rebut the presumption of control that's in the model law. Also, this is this is how the guidebook currently requires you to identify owners that own 10% or more, regardless of the industry. That's the current requirement in the guidebook as well.
All right. Any other final thoughts before we wrap up? It's been great discussion.
Behind this model state law for money services businesses, is it going to be pushed out for other mortgage companies, mortgage services, mortgage lenders, mortgage brokers? Is that your understanding?
There is no plan to do that, no.
It's still built as a model law for all industries. So you can see our concern on the mortgage side. You're going well beyond what's been required to date. And I'm trying to understand the reasoning for that. Was there some problem with states that weren't reaching the owners of licensees, the companies that own licensees and their managers? Was there some concern that states have? Were they getting away with something? Were they harming consumers? Were they making unfair profits? I don't
So
understand.
The genesis here is the FinTech Industry Advisory Panel in reviewing the standards applicable to money transmitters in 50 states. The uniformity on the mortgage side is, frankly, there's much more uniformity in mortgage than there is in money transmission. And I think the SAFE Act has a lot to do with that. That's where we're coming from in a position where there's a lot of uniformity to be made up without any federal guidance to do so.
Well, I hear you. And from the last panel, we're not going to be licensing branches of companies in the future, but we're licensing companies who are removed from national licensee and may just have an ownership interest in licensing because it exceeds 10%. You're going well beyond what the laws have, most of the state laws have required to date, and I ask you to reconsider that language. If you keep it up to the money services businesses because they're comfortable with that, that's the language in which you regulate to date, that's one thing. But mortgage lenders, brokers, and services haven't been licensed under such language, and I ask you to reconsider that.
Especially as you're building the system using that language. So we certainly appreciate your time and the consideration that you're giving to it, and we hope that other state regulators out there will certainly take a look at it as they consider adopting the model law in their states to determine truly what this means as we look at the interplay between this law, the act, and what's being built into modernization as well.
And one last comment, Jim, thanks for the kind words at the beginning of this presentation. I do appreciate it. I'm glad to be here. In fact, I'm glad to be anywhere.
Yep. Good to see you too, Gus, and we're definitely glad to have you back. So, well, thank you for the discussion, everybody. That was great. I think we're at a stopping point here where we're going to go ahead and start to wrap it up. So, thank you for the panel, everybody here. Appreciate your time. You can go ahead and exit the stage by muting and stopping your camera. Take it easy. Okay, so before we wrap it up, we just have a few more items to cover. And I just wanted to say, as we close, thank you so much for your participation. Thank you for bearing with the virtual meeting setup. I'm sorry that we can't engage the same way we can as we do in person, and I do hope to be back there as soon as we can do so as a group. So thank you again to all of our topic presenters and panelists today for taking the time and effort to discuss the issues here and bring forward these important conversations. I always enjoy this meeting. And I thank you for everybody here that's attending. Sorry we can't engage again like we typically do in person, but we definitely are looking for further conversations down the road. It's my pleasure to continue serving as your ombudsman. I look forward to continued discussions. And again, I just wanted to say we have got the inbox at email ombudsman@nmls.org. Please reach out if you have any questions or follow-ups at all. And before we adjourn, I do want to just give it over back to Stephanie. She's got a few last reminders. And thanks again, everybody, for attending.
Thank you, Jim. And thank you to our panelists and all the attendees that tuned in today. In the chat, you'll find the link to our post-meeting survey. Please take a few minutes to let us know how the meeting went for you today. The meeting's recording will be posted on nmls.org next week. Check there for updates on the meeting recording and future ombudsman meetings. Thank you again for attending today. Stay safe, be well, and goodbye, everybody. Have a good rest of your week.